Thank you, Greg. Delighted to get to spend this time with you and have a bit of a chat with Mark. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you who don't know the schedule, Mark's been here at the business school since before 8 o'clock this morning. We've run him from audience to audience and certainly extracted more than our pound of flesh, but never one to not take 2 pounds when you can get it. He's graciously agreed to have a chat with me this evening, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. And to in turn, after a bit of chat, we'll turn it to the audience to see if you have any questions that you would like to ask directly to Mark. So with that said, here we go, Mark. Again, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. The proverbial thing to ask CEOs is what keeps you up at night. But I want to focus that down a little bit further because you've been billed as a turnaround specialist, excellent in crisis management. There was a news story this week that said you were a Kiwi, but Kiwis are birds that look under leaves for worms. And they weren't very sure you were a Kiwi. They thought you were more like a raptor, I think was the language the article used.
I thought it was very unkind, actually. But
yeah, so I've been keen to see who's going to show up tonight, the Kiwi or the raptor or somewhere in between. So what I'd like for you to do is tell me a little bit in that special context of crisis or turnaround. What keeps you up at night? What really worries you? What do you pay attention to during that time?
I mean, well, thanks, Kevin. And Kevin and I had a chat yesterday, so we were discussing what we're going to talk about tonight. What keeps me up at night? It's more the things you can't control. And you can look at it and you look at it, whether it's business or whatever. Most things in business actually you can control. You can control your people, you can control your balance sheet, you can control pretty much most aspects of it. It's the unknown things, it's the geopolitical stuff, it's the wars, it's the floods, it's the events that blow you off course. And there was a guy, Harold Macmillan, he was a British Prime Minister, I think in the 50s. And he was asked once, as a Prime Minister, what are the things that blow you off course? And he said, events, dear boy, events. And that's pretty much the same. I said to a group today, there's that other global statesman and intellectual by the name of Mike Tyson. And
almost as good as Donald Trump.
Yeah, well, he's right. Yeah, these Americans, they do it well, right? But he said, when he was asked about plans, because of course you can plan for many things, and they asked Mike Tyson about his opponents, and he said, every opponent I fight has a plan to beat me until I punch them in the mouth. And when you think of it that way, every CEO in the world gets punched in the metaphorical mouth. And it's generally events that you can't think of and you can't control. And I guess I've built my career in trying to clean up some of those messes created by events that a lot of CEOs didn't either think about, or maybe they managed their company poorly, so when those events came up, they got punched too many times in the mouth.
So take me to the global financial crisis. You're at AIA at the time, and a division, a unit, a business of AIG, and an organization that famously got in trouble during the GFC. Tell us a little bit about those events and your reaction as the leader of AIA within the parent AIG and managing that conflict and the sort of the multiplicity of do I do what the parent says? Do I do what's best for the business? Talk about that.
There's some stories behind that, but when you have a look at it, so AIG's problems were entirely foreseeable. You had a company that got in trouble, and it shouldn't have got in trouble. It did things with its business that it just shouldn't have done and destroyed a legacy for many generations of management leaders before it. But if you can picture it this way, Kevin, I was sitting at home in a leather chair and I was on the phone to three different people. There's the head of the New York Fed, the head of the Bermuda Monetary Authority, and the head of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And it was 4:30 in the morning. When that happens, you know you have a problem. And they were all on the phone at the same time. And I rang up my team, the key members of my team, and said, we need to meet. The parent's collapsed. I don't think it's going to be around come morning. And so when your parent company collapses And by the time I got into the office, there was queues outside every office we had around Asia. It was the headline story on CNN. When I got into the office, there's camera crews everywhere, and it was total chaos. And what do you do? I mean, there's no books being, I was talking to some of the faculty today, there's no books being written on it. You've never done that before, or at least I'd never done it before. It's not something you want to do too many times either. And that really is a crisis. And when you think about it that way, just for context, AIA at the time owned 43% of the long end of the Thailand government bonds. So the whole Thai economy was leveraged to us, I guess, that if we'd fallen over, that would have fallen over. And it was a huge company. It was 300,000 staff and agents. So what about their families? Or I don't know how many customers it was, maybe 25 million. And so that sort of focuses your mind. And the whole team, and I had an extraordinary team of people at that time, but the whole team, no one went home for weeks. I literally didn't go home for 14 days. I don't think I had a full day off in 8.5 months. And it was an extraordinary time that I don't think you could do it. I don't think I could do it again because physically and mentally it was just too tough. And there was, as you say, there was, on one side you had a parent company wanted to put their hands in and take all our capital and money and being backed by the US government. And on the other side, you have a fiduciary duty to all the countries which you operated in. And if they'd taken the money out, then AIA would have gone broke. And it was on the edge because of what the parent had done. It was on the edge, and it was an extraordinary time in our history. And the market turmoil we're seeing now just isn't even really close to what you saw in 2008. Not even really close.
Yeah, when we were talking yesterday, you talked about putting a ring fence around AIA, and that later AIA became, I think, the largest IPO in history, maybe still the second largest after Alibaba. But conceptually, this notion of telling the parent, no, I'm building the ring fence around, how did you come to that? You said quite a bit to me about the importance of doing the right thing. So could you build on that statement a little bit, and your thinking around doing the right thing?
Be careful what I say. Straight talk, right?
Exactly, that's why I'm here.
I mean, you had, at that stage, I had phone calls from the then CEO, this is a few months later, actually, from the then CEO of AIG, and said, you know, we want the cash. And we saw the financial crisis coming, so we'd stockpiled quite a few billion of cash in the company. And the CEO said he wanted it, and he picked up the phone and he's yelling at me down the phone. And he said, and I quote, "If you don't do it, I'll fire your ass." So I hung up on him. Which
as you do with your boss. Remember that, Greg?
Which probably wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done, to be fair. But I take this view in business that if you make your judgments on a value set first, then, and just do what's right, then you will come out of it the right way. And I had a team who, through that whole period, I think we only lost one person through that quite extraordinary period. These people were working 20 hours in the day, and it wasn't for money. We weren't paying them more, but in an environment like that, everyone actually does want to do the right thing. And in a crisis, most people do want to do the right thing. And I look back on it, I'm still in contact with many of those people. When you go through a time like that, you build an extraordinary bond with some of those people.
How about decision making? How does decision making change in a period of crisis or turmoil?
See, I believe that consensus and crisis are two words that don't go together. Right? And if you have a look through any crisis, people want to be led. And whether, and in that case it was my responsibility, but whether I was right or wrong isn't the point, because if I'm wrong, someone will find out soon enough. And the worst thing you can do is be sort of paralyzed by fear, and too many companies, when they go through a crisis, won't make a decision. And many years ago, it was actually in Auckland, I heard Norman Schwarzkopf speak. Remember Storm and Norman? And Storm and Norman said, when in charge, take charge. And that was sort of his philosophy, that if you get it wrong, you'll find out soon enough. And I believe in a crisis, it is the same, that you've got to make a decision. If you get it wrong, then you'll change it quickly enough. But if you don't make a decision, that's the thing that actually causes organizations, particularly large organizations, to spiral. And that's when when you make bad decisions and the organization goes down. That's actually what happened. And how many times do you see that? A lot.
So so putting this together is 14 days I don't go home, 8.5 months I don't have a day off, doing the same thing with my team, becoming a more authoritarian leader, I think is
it's not textbook stuff, is it? Really? It's,
yeah, but I mean, how do you maintain your own resilience and the resilience of the team in such circumstances? I know you talked about doing the right thing, and I'm sure that's a powerful motivator. But there must be some other key tips you might have for us around that.
I mean, actually, one of the students today in the session we had this evening actually asked me that same question.
I should have been.
And I mean, my view is, it's normally about balance. Normally I'd handle that by keeping fit and that sort of stuff. It is about getting a support network, though. I mean, it's whether it's the people in your team or coming home to New Zealand, which is, there's always a drawback to New Zealand. And New Zealand's one of those places that, I'm only here for 3 days this time, but it's still a place, it might not look like it, but it's still a place that sort of recharges your batteries and you get a better sense of what's important and that balance and stuff in your career. But at that sort of time, we didn't actually have time to think. So there was some people in my team who I thought were really good who just cracked under the strain. And because there was one person who was professionally, I won't say his field, but he was one of the best in his field. It was a technical sort of field, but he was used to a very structured role, and in a crisis you haven't got that, because there's no book you can pick up to understand it. And there were some of the people who I thought were pretty average who in the crisis were just quite outstanding. And I see a guy there, Andy, who was with me in Hong Kong over that time, and remembers some of this sort of stuff. But in a crisis, it makes some people survive and some don't. And you see that in governments too.
So you've had a lot of experience in Southeast Asia before going to Aviva, and we will get around to Aviva, I promise. But China is a country of much interest to Kiwis in general because they're a large trading partner, and increasingly large trading partner. What observations might you share with us around China, around allegations that there's more corruption there than other places? And tell us a little bit about China.
And throughout my career, I've realized now that in the West, we have quite a myopic view on China and the East. I mean, in London, people still talk about Asia as the Far East. Oh, did you go to the Far East? When you're in Asia, it's not that far. And we have this cultural bias, and we think that China's corrupt and everything else. I can tell you, for example, in my world, insurance fraud is far greater in the UK than I ever saw in Indonesia. Whiplash fraud in the UK is 27 times whiplash levels than France. And so I tease my British colleagues and say, so British necks are 27 times weaker than French necks. The French agree with me, the British don't on that. But if you have a look at China, it's, or any part in Asia, and all the cultures obviously are hugely diverse in Asia. But China is going through a tough period, and there's implications for New Zealand on that. So, I don't know, about 6 months ago, I was being interviewed on CNBC, and I'd said then that I thought that China was going to take what I called a Shanghai sabbatical. And meaning that China has gone through 20 years of growth. The first 10 years were double-digit growth. The second 10 years, every year that growth has declined. And the growth at the moment, they say, is 5.7, and according to our maths, it's probably more like 3.7. And so China now is having to relearn and retool. So you've had management teams that they've only ever operated in a market where you could get 10 or 11 or 12% growth. Now what? and they think 3 or 4 or 5% growth, they think it's negative. They think it's a huge recession. And so I called it Shanghai sabbatical because I think that China needs to relearn how to manage in a lower growth environment. The fact is that China is no longer cheap to manufacture goods. And the fact is that it's not consuming the same iron ore, so Australia's struggling. The fact is they're not importing as much commodities generally, and you're seeing dairy getting hit in a massive way here. And you know what? I don't think it's going to change to 2019 or 2020. And so when you have a look at things like dairy prices in New Zealand, it's going to be a tough few years. And we've been operating on these sort of prices in New Zealand for quite some time, and I think this is a problem. So you've had an economy that's been fueled by high dairy prices, and a Christchurch rebuild that companies like mine paid for. I think it's what, 15. Yeah, it was quite good, wasn't it? But that's what we're there for. But it's in the top 5 biggest biggest natural disasters in history, the Christchurch earthquake. In the top 5 in history economically, I'm talking about financially. And so you can see when you get an event that big, it does fuel the economy. And I think the government's actually done a pretty good job in the last period of time. In fact, an excellent job. But it was fueled by Christchurch, and it was fueled by economic prices. And as China does retreat for a number of years, it's going to be a tough period. And you've got an oil glut, you've got geopolitical problems around the world. There's going to be some issues because economics typically breeds discontent, which typically breeds war. And you ask what keeps me up at night? Those sort of things, I think, are major worries globally at the moment.
Yeah. It's so events, my boy.
Events, my dear boy, events.
There you go. All right, so you've done this great turnaround in Asia. In many ways, the IPO of AIA saved IAIG. Probably the world is your oyster at this point, and you landed Aviva. Why Aviva? What attracted you?
No, it took a rest for 2 years, if the truth be known. I was contracted out anyway, but I took 2 years off, and it was great. My tennis game improved, which you needed to improve markedly.
I didn't know if you wanted to tell them about the 2 years off, so I thought I'd leave it to you.
But yeah, I went to Aviva, and Aviva's one of those iconic brands in the UK. We haven't had a business here for a long time. I used to own here, I think it was State and NZI and I think Commercial Union at one stage and other businesses. But it's an iconic business. It's been around for 320 years. So it started in 1696. So the Great Fire of London was 1666. And in those days, it was the start of, in actual fact, fire insurance. It was a company called Hand in Hand, which is a delightful name when you think about it. And in those days, there was no such thing as a fire brigade. So you'd insure your house. That was the beginning of sort of insurance in 1696. And above the door, you'd have something called a fire mark. And it was made of bronze or copper, and it would have the sort of coat of arms, in that case, Hand in Hand. And we'd have lookouts. We'd own the fire stations. There was no fire stations. And you'd see smoke in the city of London in the square mile, and they'd run around with their axes, and they would put out the fire, but only if you had a fire mark. If not, bye-bye. And so that was long before fire brigades. And in fact, in my office, I have the breastplate from one of the first firemen's uniforms. And on the back of it, and they had all these ornate uniforms, these big sort of ornate helmets, and it was like this huge sort of military uniform. And there's the breastplate. It's the only thing we got left since 1696. And on the back of it is scratched Londinium 1696, number 3 station. And on the back of it, so it's a remarkable sort of history. And Aviva, like so many other organisations, hubris got the better of them. And they made some dumb financial decisions. So technically the company's amazing. It's got all this talent right the way through it. But they invested £5 billion in the US and lost it all, and they just made some dumb decisions and thought really short term. And if you think short term in a long term business, you're going to make mistakes, and they did. And so when I went there, and it's a company that's its assets are about 550 billion US, give or take. So it's got a big asset pool, but the central liquidity, the amount of cash left at the group centre, was only about 200 million, which just isn't enough. And for a company like that, we had capital of 3.6 billion, which was about probably a third of what it needed. So they asked me to go and try and sort it out, and it's not something you take lightly. And I went through about 42 hours of discussions with the board about whether I was a good fit and whether I thought they were a good fit for me and vice versa. But that's what I did. But it's a remarkable company. I mean, I love history, and you can't beat history of 320 years. The only older company we're aware of that's still working in the UK is a company called the Bank of England, which started in 1694. And most people don't know the Bank of England is actually a working bank. Despite it being like the Reserve Bank, it's actually still a working bank. It has a couple of counters in their office that still work.
You mentioned the word iconic in describing Aviva. What do you think are the ingredients of an iconic company? And you also talked about thinking long-term versus short-term. How does one think long-term, build an iconic company, keep those principles in place?
It's about value set, isn't it? So if you ever look at successful sports teams, religion and business, they have three ingredients, I believe, that are totally common across the three. They have icons. There's a little team that did pretty well in the UK last year. Boy, it was good being in the UK last year. The All Blacks, they've got an icon, so the black jersey and the silver fern. Religion has, whatever religion has different icons, whether it's a cross or whatever. And iconic companies, Apple has an apple. So that's icons. The rituals, you have rituals, whether it's the haka, whether it's religion's got all sorts of rituals in it. And the other one is a value set. So whether you have a business or whether you have a sports team, the value set in the All Blacks is, they're temporary custodians of the jersey and they never believe they're going to lose. And same with religion as a value set, and same with business. And each of those three things is important. So at Aviva, one of the first things I did, other than set the vision, was actually with the team determine what our value set is. And in our case, there was only four. And I don't mean things like honesty, integrity. Well, that's, blah, blah, blah. That's all very nice. But those are hygiene factors. Everyone, just to be in business, you should have honesty and integrity and hard work and that. So it's what you want to differentiate your company. And in this case, what we did, we had four values. One of them was I stole unashamedly from the All Blacks, which was create legacy or be a good ancestor, which was, we're temporary guardians of a 320-year-old organisation. And so we said we want all our decisions to be long-term, not short-term. If I want short-term decisions, I'll just put the dividend up tomorrow, the stock price will jump really quickly, and then what? So it's that sort of stuff. The second one was care more. It just means do the right thing. Don't worry about the regulators say, or governments or shareholders, just do the right thing. And if you do the right thing, you're not going to get in trouble as a business. The third one was never rest, which sometimes means not get much sleep, which is true some of the time. But more often it means about just always be unhappy with the status quo. Just never be satisfied with where the business is. Always be looking to improve it or the customer experience, and that's never rest. And the last one is one we call kill complexity. And when I was debating these values with my board at dinner one night, and one of my mentors is a guy called John McFarlane, who's now the chairman of Barclays. He used to be the CEO of ANZ Bank. And we were debating the values, and the board hated the kill complexity. And some of the board are saying, Mark, you can't have the word kill in a value. And I said, that's why I'm the CEO and it's my decision, it's not yours. That was one of my less consultative moments, right? And this debate raged for about 20 minutes. I mean, it's literally, and it's over in a fun sort of way. And then John McFarlane, showing the wisdom of a fine chairman, and he said, right, enough debate. He said, Mark, I agree with the rest of the board. You can't use the word kill in a value. He said, I prefer the word murder. But, I mean, it is about, the values are your decision-making criteria. They're the thing that guides, because people will change and your strategy will change, but your value set shouldn't in a business. And that's the thing that should be enduring. And I sacked quite a number of people in my senior team because they weren't consistent with that value set I wanted. I don't mean they were unethical. I don't mean they didn't have integrity. That's not what I mean. But it was about thinking short term rather than long term. It was about not necessarily doing the right thing. I think they all did the right thing. But if they weren't consistent with the value set, I don't care how good they are, then they can't work in the organisation. And we let go of a lot of people because of a value set thing.
Yeah. Returning to that long-term notion, and I'll get this story wrong, but I think you were the first business person to address the UN or
The
something.
UN General Assembly, yeah.
Talk a little bit about that experience, how it came about, I remember it sort of went sideways for a few moments and then...
Yeah, I mean, it's quite intimidating. I don't know whether anyone's seen the big green plinth they have at the UN, and it's this massive room. It's about, there's no pillars in it, and it's, I don't know how many times the size of this room widthwise, but it's just huge. And a couple of years ago, I spoke at an economist conference, and I was talking about sustainability and long-term thinking in business and what business is there for. Because I believe business isn't there to make money, that's a necessary byproduct of it. But you've got to have some bigger purpose in the business. There's got to be a use for the business. And I was talking about that, and then it led, I got invited to speak at a UN subgroup called the Global Compact. And I did that speech, and then from there they launched something called the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which was Ban Ki-moon's, I guess that's the thing that his tenure will be remembered for. And so they ran me up through my team and said, would you speak at it? And of course I said yes. And it was the same day the Pope spoke and most of the sort of global leaders spoke. So I don't get intimidated that easy, but I was a bit. And then the night before they rang me up, and I flew to New York for it, and the night before they rang me up and said, actually you can't speak, which is nice because I'd just flown to New York. And they said you can't speak, and they said because a business person's never spoken at the General Assembly before. You've got to be a political figure to speak. And so I said, okay, but I still got an invite, and went and heard all these speakers speak. And then we're in a break, and I get a call on my mobile, and they said, we've changed the protocol. You're on in 20 minutes. Tremendous, right? And so
it's just the United Nations and following the Pope, but that's okay.
Well, yeah, and you go out, and I followed Modi, and you go in the room behind it, and you go in there, and you meet all sorts of interesting people, and then they haul you out there. And until that moment, I had no idea how long I was going to speak for, until I stood in front of that green plinth, and there's a clock that's ticking down from 5 minutes. And I found out later that everyone gets 5 minutes, it's just no one sticks to it in the political world. Modi spoke for 18 minutes, 13 minutes over, and the president said he had 1 minute extra for every 100 million people. But it was a unique experience, but you realise that the bureaucracy of government, they're focused on quite a narrow part of the world, and the goals are the right thing. I mean, it's talking about trying to eradicate poverty and climate change, and there's 17 goals, and it's all good stuff, but you can't achieve it through the public sector. It's impossible to achieve what they want, and the only way to achieve what they're looking for in terms of the goals and sustainability is through business. And business, capitalism in terms of my view, has been the biggest force for liberation in history. Look at China alone. 680 million people went above the poverty line in the last decade. That wasn't communism that did that, that was capitalism. And in my view, if you look economically, China's probably one of the most capitalist nations on Earth at the moment. There's a few other issues there as well, but they won't delve into tonight. But in terms of economically, make no mistake, entrepreneurialism is alive and well, far more so than most European markets that I work in now. When I got the job at Aviva, I was having lunch with one of the main Chinese banks chairman, and he said, "What are you doing that for? What are you going to Europe for?" And he said, "Mark, if you want capitalism, come to China. If you want socialism, go to the UK." But he wasn't being funny. And economically, there's no doubt that for many years China has been economically, not politically, and I certainly differentiate the two, but economically parts of Asia are really like we were in the Western world probably 20 years ago in terms of the ability to innovate. And I think a lot of our society, New Zealand probably does better than most, but particularly in Europe has lost a lot of the ability to innovate, and it's something that is worrying a lot of people in Europe and the EU because it has become a huge bureaucracy.
Well, Mark, you've, I guess I could go on and ask you a bunch of questions, but you've been generous with your time talking to me on the phone when you were back in the UK. I got to pepper you with lots of questions, the coffee yesterday, the time today. So I think this is the right time to turn to the audience and say, do you have any questions that you would like to ask Mark?
Hi, I'm Matt. Can you just give us some thoughts on what sort of pressures you get from shareholders in terms of short-term profits given your thinking is long-term?
Well, I just had my results last Thursday, actually. So shareholders, particularly in the UK, are extraordinarily focused on dividends and short-term. And so what I did last week, and the results were pretty good last week, so I was able to, I guess. But basically, I went to them and said, I could have paid you whatever dividend I liked because the results were really good. But you know what? I want shareholders who want to think long-term. We just killed our quarterly reporting. Last week I announced that we're just killing our quarterly reporting, so we'll just do mid-year and full year and take out the other two. Because if you do quarterly reporting, it just focuses you on such a short time frame, you're going to make the wrong decisions. And my point to shareholders was that's how we got into the mess a few years ago. Because shareholders always want more information and they always want short-term returns. And you know what? I want shareholders who want long-term returns. That doesn't mean you can't get them year after year after year, because I still expect to get returns year after year after year. And we've done pretty well over the last couple of years because we're saying, it's my create legacy value again. It's about thinking long-term and everything. But shareholders are getting more and more short-term. You've got the way that, and we've got fund managers in the room here actually, but it's the way that fund managers, and you get all the quant models that buy and sell stocks in a millisecond. And data means that they're thinking more short and shorter term. And I think this is a big problem. I think it's a problem for business. I think it's a problem for government. I think it's a problem for capital. And there's so much capital in the world. How do you manage it? So there is extraordinary pressure on it, but I make no excuses for it. Now I say, well, if you want short-term results, don't invest in me. And it's interesting though that we are, so the investor base has sort of swapped itself out. And that's the sort of investors you want. There's so much liquidity in the world at the moment that's looking for a home, and when you've got interest rates as low as they are, I mean, if you get, I said last week, we target on our earnings, we want 5% growth. I mean, we've got 20% this year actually, but we're targeting 5% growth year after year after year after year. And it doesn't really matter what the economy does for us to get that growth.
Here in the middle.
Speaking of events, what are your thoughts on the potential of Brexit, both for your company and for the UK generally?
Actually, I'm doing a speech on that next week. Actually, there's two. I've got to write on the way home in the plane, but there's two big referendums on at the moment. There's the EU one, and there's one about a flag here, right? And I voted as well, by the way. So Brexit is a big deal in the UK. And it's been around for a while, and everyone's looking at, for those who aren't close to the debate, Brexit's the British exit from the EU, or the referendum on that. And everyone's looking at the EU through an economic lens, and I get that. But the reality is it was set up not for economics, it was set up to stop war and conflict. And it's been extraordinarily successful. There's not been a conflict between member states of the EU since it was set up 50 years ago. It's been the longest period of peace in Europe, I'm talking about the member states, in history. So it's been extraordinarily successul. So should the UK, and I'm not a fan of Brussels, just to be clear. I think it's probably the most bureaucratic organisation I've ever witnessed. and it needs to be reformed, there's no doubt about that. But if Europe leaves the EU, there is a lot of economic impacts to it. So our view as a company is that the risks of leaving are just too great. And that doesn't mean I don't think that the UK should build up trade with other countries. And countries like New Zealand, we're an old friend of the UK, and so when they went into the EU, they sort of forgot about us. Well, they need to rebuild some of those ties. They need to build ties with Asia and Singapore and Malaysia and so on. The UK does more trade with, I don't know, Belgium than it does with all of Southeast Asia. And that's a problem because it's so economically so focused on the EU, and it is a problem. But our view and our company's view is that we're better off in it. And we do have to take a view because we've got so much investment funds around Europe, we do have to take a view on it. So, I don't know, I think that British people are inherently conservative. You can tell by the rugby. And they're inherently conservative, but because of that conservatism, I suspect, I hope they will stay in. I get to vote on that one too. I get to vote all over the place. So I will.
Here in the middle.
Mark, you mentioned quoting the great General Schwarzkopf, when in charge, take charge. Does that mean that you're in favour of hierarchically structured business setups? Because that tends to not find much favour now, certainly judged by what's taught in most business schools nowadays. Or is this just a crisis situation?
Yeah, I'm talking more crisis, but I hate consensus management. I think it's a disease in business which makes it more about, I'll tell you, my very first executive meeting that I was chairing, so this is going back to January 2013, and I walked in the room and I'd met them all the week before, and there's about a dozen people, and it was the most bizarre discussion. So someone would come up and say, well, we've got a business case to spend £20 million on this, and everyone go, yes, yes, yes. And there was no challenge and there was no pushback, and they'd say, I'd like consensus on that, please. And I'm listening to this, and the next person would say, I've got a 30 million case for this, and I'd like the group's agreement to this. And then the third person, who I fired the next day, yeah, well, she said, I've got a case for this, and I'd like the group's blessing. I said, oh, enough. This isn't a democracy. You all paid a lot of money, make a decision, and the rest of you should be challenging that decision. And if you don't challenge the decision, you're of no use to me. And basically, I kicked everyone out and got them in, and half of them weren't there the next day. I mean that quite literally. And if you're in a crisis situation, you've got to change. Management theory, I think, says you've got to change about 40% actually to make it work. But so my style is not consensus, but it is consultative, and there's a big, big difference. So I believe in consultation, and we started up a digital garage, and it's the furthest where we do all our digital businesses, and after 18 months it's got £1.3 billion of revenue, so it's growing really, really fast. But that's the total antithesis of a hierarchy. If I wore a tie or a suit in there, in fact I did once and they cut my tie off. And you've got to make those sort of icons a change. So I'm quite consultative, but there's a big difference between consensus and consultation. A huge difference. If people are in a leadership role, then they should make decisions, and they should make sure the people below them can make decisions.
There was a hand just in here somewhere. Yes, sir. And then we'll come back to you on the back row. And then I'll look this way.
You spoke a lot about values. Some might say that the level of trust that people had in the financial services market was seriously damaged by the GFC. In your judgment, has that trust been re-established from the eyes of the consumer around the world?
I think it varies market by market and country by country. So in some markets, China, for example, people still would trust a bank. In the UK, banks are probably the least trusted organisations, and some of it well deserved. The things that went on in the GFC were inexcusable, the decisions that were made and the leverage that were taken. But make no mistake, the GFC wasn't just caused by the banks or companies like AIG. It was caused by a collision of dumb policy, and so macroeconomic policy, and micro-regulation. So you have regulators looking at micro level, just trying to stop people do bad things, and when the risks that bring economies or businesses down are generally macro issues, so the large economic issues. So in the US you had a government that decided that everyone should be able to own their own home. Now that's noble and that's a nice sentiment, but paying people to get in their own home when they were never going to be able to afford it just meant that it created a crisis for those individuals' lives that wrecked their lives as well. And then you had a banking system that leveraged up that and made extraordinary amounts of money, and so you had just bad decisions all along. So I think different brands and different organisations have different levels of trust. For all the problems that Aviva had, there was plenty of gifts I didn't want to open on Christmas Day that my predecessor left me. The best thing they left me was this wonderful brand. You know, Aviva's got a 10% unprompted recall in China. How do you get a 10% unprompted recall in China? And it's partly to do with our JV partner, who happens to have 700 million customers, but COFCO is our JV partner. But so it's different in different brands in different countries. In the UK though, banking has become the punching bag for every journalist or politician that wants to remember, and frankly it's time that they moved on from it. One of the biggest banks that had a huge bailout in the UK is one called Royal Bank of Scotland, RBS. Incidentally, which is run by a close mate of mine who's a Kiwi, a guy called Ross McEwen. And if you have a look at the UK financial industry, of the top 10 financial companies in the UK, just about all of them are run by foreigners, which is interesting in itself.
The lady in the back row center.
So you mentioned before that when you did have your crisis, some of your team cracked and some of them did really well. So in your hindsight and your experience, what can we do to best prepare ourselves for our own crises and to manage them without them more or less successfully?
It's hard to work out the people that are going to be successful or not, but I've hired some of them, I must confess back again. I think the things, you can never plan for a crisis. It's like Mike Tyson said, I mean, plans are great, but it's not the plans themselves. So I can guarantee in a crisis you will never use that plan. And regulators have this naive thing that they think, well, you can do resolution plans, it's all good. What's important is the process to get you there. So one of the things that saved AIA is we had a fantastic project infrastructure. So on the morning when the parent collapsed, we were able to basically use that infrastructure we built in terms of crisis. So we had 12 work streams, and one was on capital, and one was on regulation, and one was on comms, and so on. We had 12 different things. And we were able to use that infrastructure. It was basically reporting infrastructure and managing it. And people were used to working under pressure and deadlines to get it done. So it's more the process than the actual plan. People put way too much faith in plans, and the only thing I can guarantee is that the plan, you'll never use it in a crisis. So one of the other things that I worry about constantly in terms of big business now is data and data security, and I think most of the world's just really naive on data security. And we do crisis sessions where we assume that someone's stolen our customer data and it's put online or whatever, and we go through scenario testing. So the scenario testing is worth it, but the actual plan you're going to put behind it isn't. Does that make sense?
My chair is angled this way, so I'm going to look this way for a second. Do I have a question over here? Yes, sir.
Thinking of sponsorship for a moment, Mark, and the All Blacks, of course, currently wearing AIG. How successful?
It's not their best decision.
How successful is that sponsorship for AIG, and what are the principal criteria when you're considering sponsoring any organisation?
It's been extraordinarily successful because there's few brands in the world that untainted sporting brands like that one, and the win-loss ratio. I mean, people don't realise, when I read the press here, and I read New Zealand press every day for what it's worth, there's always comments about what's said in the UK. I can tell you that brands like the All Blacks are legendary in the UK. People revere and respect it. Doesn't mean they won't cheer for their own team, but the one thing I would say in the UK is they're extraordinarily good sports of great play, whether it's cricket or rugby, football not so much. But of some of the sports and tennis, they're extraordinarily supportive. And so my understanding is, and I still have a number of people that I keep in contact with in AIG, they think it's been extraordinarily successful. I remember thinking it was sacrilege that they put a name on the front of our black jersey, and any name but that one. But I mean, sports sponsorship has its moments. We've done a lot of sports sponsorship in the past. We're actually pulling back from sports sponsorship. The Aviva Premiership, the Rugby Premiership in the UK, we sponsor things like the stadium in Dublin. I was in Dublin 2 weeks ago, and I went through immigration, and the woman there said, what are you here for, business, who you work for, Aviva? She said, is that the stadium or the insurance company? But I guess they're one and the same. And which made me think it was working. It cost us quite a few years ago a lot of money, but our brand awareness unprompted in Ireland is 86%. And last year I went to a game at the stadium, and I said, take me to Lansdowne Road, and the taxi driver said, oh, you mean the Aviva. So it's only known as the Aviva. So it can work for name awareness, but then if you have name awareness, the question on sponsorship I'd say is then what? And getting associated with the All Blacks is great, but it's still, what is it, 20 odd million US or something, give or take a year? That's still a lot of money. So you need to make sure you're getting a whole lot of brand awareness for that. But once you've got the brand awareness, and as an organisation, Aviva in our markets has extraordinary brand recall. So now the next thing for us is, well, what do you want that brand to stand for, and how do you do that? I've just changed our advertising, and we started in the UK, but it's going to be globally, where 80% of our spend was on TV. As of this year, 50% social media. So 50% of advertising is now social media, whether it's everything from search engine optimization to, and our ads are now basically reality TV, to the point where some of the TV channels have approached us wanting to make series of it, which was interesting itself. So all our advertising on TV is literally reality TV. We get families together and they'll do challenges, and you don't pay them a cent. Everyone wants to be on TV. So but sponsorship has its place. I think the sports sponsorship is going to decrease though in the next 10 years. I think it's going to decrease. I think there's become much more risk in it, as the tennis world found out a couple of days ago.
Yes, here in the blue shirt.
Mark, thanks so much for the kindness. I did have a question about your morals or your ethics and how they turn up at work. Because obviously you've landed on who you are and that turns up at work. But was there a point when you had to make a decision about which way you'd go, whether it was policy, what was popular, or what was right? Whereabouts, can you tell us some stories or events?
Yeah, there was, but it was really early on, and I've got a couple of family here tonight, but there was my grandfather actually when, and I can't remember when it was, but he used to say, he'd say, Mark, when you're in a business position, the objective of that is, and my dad used to say, my dad's here too actually, but it'd say the objective of leadership is not to be loved, it's to be respected for doing the right thing. And if you take that as your mantra and you don't do what's populist, I wish a few politicians would do the same thing, then you make decisions. In the global financial crisis, at one stage, the AIG tried to sell AIA to another company. And it was the wrong decision. Both companies would have collapsed under the debt load. It would have been the biggest rights issue or corporate takeover in UK's history. And it wouldn't have worked. And they offered me a lot of money to support the deal. So if I'd done that, that means you're selling yourself for something you don't believe in. So those are key decision points. And the minute you do that, what's the difference between that and other unethical behaviour? Right? Because you, as a CEO, someone once told me, you cast a long shadow and you forget. So if I turn up to work drunk or with a hangover one morning, and I turn up late in the morning and turn up in the meeting, then everyone in that meeting thinks that's okay. and then they'll do it, and it goes through the pyramid of the organisation. And so it's good and bad. Your spikes, so your bad points also cast that long shadow. So if I'm too tough in a meeting, or I don't treat someone as good as I should, then my spikes, if I'm too edgy with someone and push them too hard, then that casts a long shadow as well. But you've got to make those decisions. You make those decisions early and you get known for it really quickly. And there's a lot of CEOs in the world that I look at and think, well, I definitely wouldn't want to be like them. And some of them make a lot of money and some of their companies are really successful, but you've got to have that. And New Zealand is sort of known for that. There's a lot of New Zealand business leaders internationally, and New Zealand is known for that sort of value set. As a country, we have very little corruption. Or at least it was when I lived here, which I guess is a long time ago now. But it's a country that has a value set, and you know, just like it's epitomised in the sporting teams or business people, and you don't see that everywhere. So for me, it wasn't really a choice, but you make that choice. You make that choice early. I was talking to some of the undergraduate students today, and I said, "What do you want to be known for as a leader?" And there were some really smart kids here today, and I said, "What do you want to be known for? And what's your point of differentiation? What's your brand? What decisions are you going to make when it comes to that point? You know, if someone offers to pay you a whole lot of money to support a deal, you know that's wrong. What would you do?" Yeah, I mean, it's those sort of decisions.
I just add to that answer that Mark shared with me the other day that he's never negotiated a pay package.
No.
That he's just looked at the work and said, is this work I want to do? And figures that the pay will come along. And I thought that was quite interesting.
Except I probably did with my dad for pocket money, I expect.
Well,
but that's probably about as far as it went. But I think he underpaid me, actually, just on the phone. But yeah, I mean, I haven't. I've never negotiated a pay package. And every year, you know, even a few weeks ago, end of year, my chairman comes up and says, you know, well, here's the results, and what do you think about bonus? I'm not going to discuss it with you. I'm not going to discuss my pay with my board. I'm not going to. I said, pay me what you think's fair. If I don't like it, I've got a choice too, I guess. But I don't know. And if you think again long term on that, and you don't think short term, it changes the whole dynamic.
Lady here in the red and black, yes. And yet another one in red.
My question is about a statement you made earlier where you said you went in and cleaned up the mess after someone got punched in the mouth. Now, how do you, I guess, keep yourself, how do you make that decision when you go in and you may have to work with people who were instrumental in the big screw up? How do you decide to keep them on, or try and adjust that relationship, and how do you keep yourself in the right frame of mind, because it can be really tiring cleaning up other people's messes?
I don't know. I mean, it depends on what motivates you. I've built my whole career really doing jobs that probably no one else wanted, and then I guess I made a career of doing these sort of turnarounds. And I don't look at it as cleaning up other people's messes. I look at it as, if you want to make a real difference in the business, it's actually easier to do it when it's going wrong than if it's going right. I wouldn't probably go to a business that was just going remarkably well. What value could I add? I think I'm better in a change environment. So, and in terms of the people that you inherit, there's a basic rule of thumb I was talking about before. In a senior team, if you're doing a turnaround, you really have to get rid of at least 40% of that team. Now, sometimes you promote from within. I'm not sort of leader that just goes and brings a whole lot of people I've worked with before. I think of my senior team, I think only 3 of them are from AIA. Actually, so I don't do that much. I always seed it with a couple of people that bring the culture I want, but you have to exit the people. And if people, some people, you also need to find a few people that become the cheerleaders for change. So typically I'll pick 1 or 2 other people that have been there forever, and you know they're an agent for change. So for example, my general counsel, who's a fantastic general counsel, name's Kirsty Cooper. She's been in the company since General Accident days. She's been there, I think I might say, about 27 years. Just a real force for change. She sort of understands more about the company than I'll ever know. And she's got a great value set. And when people see someone like that, that's changed and really wants to follow the direction that I wanted to go in, it brings a whole lot of other people with them. I did the same thing at AIA. and that one it was the HR head, and she'd been there for a long time and probably was one of the big barriers to change. And then when she became, I'd almost call like a cheerleader for change, she was fantastic. In fact, she now is my HR head for Aviva in Asia, for what it's worth. And I did bring her with me, but you get people like that, and that's how you do it. But you can't do it without making the tough people decisions and making them early. And you can do that. You don't want to be ruthless on this stuff. You let people leave with respect, because some of them just aren't going to fit. It's not that necessarily they've done anything wrong, but they're just not going to fit. And I reckon I've only ever made 2 mistakes on people, but I've made them way too often. One is fire too slow and promote too slow. They're the only 2 mistakes I think I've ever made, but I've made them way too often. I still keep on making them. I've never regretted firing someone too fast, and I've never regretted promoting someone too fast. Ever.
Yes.
I'm Olivia from ASB Bank Monterey.
Hi.
And thank you, Mark. And my question is, just now you mentioned your company worked with JV in China before, or still working with the JV. What are the challenges working with JVs in China?
So I've had good JVs in China and bad JVs in China, and the current one's really good, COFCO, and I'm pretty close to the president, and the chairman's actually just changed. I haven't met the new chairman. And COFCO is quite an interesting company. So COFCO does a lot of food products and things. I think I might say they've got about 700 million customers. They do a lot of the milk powder and stuff, so I don't think they were delighted with New Zealand a couple of years ago with the dramas we had at Fonterra, which I think caused them some problems. But China, the key thing is the sort of organisation that it is. They've got to have the same value set. What I mean by that, they've got to have the same vision of where you want to take the business. If they haven't, and if the management keeps on changing really fast, it's almost impossible to manage a JV in China. So we have management control of that business, but we don't manage it like that. We see it as a partnership. Last year I had the chairman and the CEO and the senior team spend a whole day with me in Hong Kong looking at the strategy for the business. And this is a pretty small business for them and us, but it's growing at sort of 100% a year. Even last year, the China slowdown still grew by 30%, so that's 230% over the last 3 years. So it's becoming quite big quite fast. China, the key thing now isn't language. It used to be. It's not skill. It used to be. It's more just about vision, where people want to take the company, and with COFCO it's a pretty good partnership, so far so good. But there's a great book written many years ago called 1 Billion Customers. I can't remember who wrote it. Some of the faculty might know that, and it was a story about all the pitfalls of doing business in China and all the mistakes people make, and most people haven't made money in China. Most haven't, and we're lucky that we're doing okay now, but there's very few financial firms have made money in China.
I know there are many more questions, but we've had you on the stage since 8 o'clock this morning, and while you're not singing for your supper, we do want to take you for some supper soon. So I'm going to take the liberty of asking the last question, which is...
There you got me worried.
You've met a lot of famous people, Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, the list goes on and on. Who do you look to for inspiration? Who inspires you as a leader?
I take little things from different people, and often it's the things you don't want to be as well that you learn the most of. I've had a couple of fabulous mentors. And mentors, I was talking to students today, mentors aren't something you do through a formal program. They're people that I'd ask for advice. And I had this Chinese guy in Hong Kong called Edmund Zare, who really built the insurance industry in Asia. He's a remarkable man with unbelievably high integrity, and he built AIA in Asia, and he hired me as his successor. And in fact, I had lunch with him just before Christmas. And people like that you meet are really good. And when you have a look at some of everyone you take something from, you mentioned Clinton, and I don't necessarily agree with his politics, but when you see Clinton, the way he looks at people and talks to people, he's one of the few people I've met where if you walked and he had a paper bag over his head, everyone would still be looking at him. And he's got this ability to hold your gaze and think you're the most important person in the world when he's talking to you, and it has nothing to do with the fact he was the president. Nothing whatsoever to do with it. I'm told he's always had that skill. And you look at that, and his memory for people and names is quite extraordinary. And you look at people like that and just the skill sets they do, and then you look at some other people and think, I definitely don't want to be like that. And someone once told me you'll learn as much from your bad boss as you will from your good boss. And if you take that attitude and remain it. But you look at leadership in small ways. You look at what the All Blacks did last year and the way they conducted themselves off the field and on the field during the World Cup was extraordinary. And the mana they showed, and mana is one of those wonderful words, isn't it, that just hasn't got any translation, but the mana and the humility they showed, and I think the leadership position, unless you can show that humility and that respect, well then you're not going to be sustainable as a leader. It just isn't going to work.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for participating.